Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Pleasure to be here. I think it's my 4th year in a row that I spent a Sunday with this fantastic room full of energy. I'm serious about that. I see the energy, the keenness that all of you have to go back into the world and help a lot of companies make a lot of money and hopefully make a lot of money in the process for yourself. What I'm here to talk about is, of course, a little more about how we make some money and how we continue to make that. But more importantly, that making money to me is done in isolation is not good enough. It's not a happy situation enough, and you miss out on a huge opportunity to make a big change. And with the example of my own company, I will try to talk a little bit about that. What you can also expect in the next hour and a half, as Mr. Chandwani rightly said, we have a factory in China, which I was never happy putting up because to me it meant losing jobs in India and taking them to China. A lot of you come from countries where this is, where you and your other citizens feel this all the time. Things are changing both in India and in China, and I will hopefully deliver a perspective on what these changes are. Even since last year, that are beginning to feed in both these countries, having a small stake in manufacturing on both these lands. Feel free to stop me and ask me questions. That's perfectly okay with me because I want this to be a little, if it is possible, to have more of a dialogue than more of a. We will take quickly first setting the stage with how hard it is for manufacturing in India to be competitive, and this is important because I think it's as tough for most other countries, what I call non-China manufacturing factories in the world, and we will take a look at why. We will look at value addition, and most importantly, I want to talk about one of my friends come to me with this question. He was, I think, working for Capgemini in Netherlands, and while the Tata team was taking over Chorus Steel several years ago, he happened to be representing Chorus from the Chorus side, their board. And he was very excited to receive a lot of Tata Consulting Services executives, people who were going to be consulting from the Tata side of the business, the Indian side of the business, on this takeover. So obviously he was very excited. He thought it's a very good opportunity to learn how the Indians think, how they are different, and why is it that Tata is taking over Chorus and not the other way around. So obviously I can imagine how excited he was for this 1 week of deliberation. And he told me that he was both disappointed on one level and excited the other. Excited because he could see a lot of professionalism in the Indian consultants, in the way they approached the whole thing, the way they negotiated that agreement, and the way they finally went away with what they thought was a win-win situation. He was disappointed because he did not see anything Indian in those consultants. If he closed his eyes, he felt it was somebody from the US or somebody from Europe, with the same training, with exactly the same background, the same way of thinking about management that he had been trained in or his colleagues from the US were trained in. So hopefully we will talk a little bit about, of course, it's a global world and I don't know if Indianness really means Indianness anymore, but I will try to give you some examples of how we can think differently in a country like India or in the East, I would say, without really spelling them out, and maybe if you like an assignment, it's to try and pick out what could be some of these Indian accents. And of course you'll be open to question and answers again. First, a very hard look at so some figures. If you're in India, you cannot do without figures of all kinds. Let's look at, take an example of my own company. We make capacitors. It's a component that goes into any electronics. Some of you, I'm sure, are aware of this. Into your laptops or into a projector like this or into lights, into automobiles. Name it, and most electronics will have, a cell phone, for example, will have some kind of capacitor in it. This is an example, a very good manufacturing opportunity because the total value addition over raw material is 50%. So that gives the management a lot of seed to bite into to be able to make a difference. What I have right here on the top is the sales value. Some figures are very Indian, but I'll explain them to you. 100 rupees or $100 is what the Chinese guy, a Chinese factory in Shenzhen, has offered to an Indian buyer in India, let's say in New Delhi. So they come to somebody who's based in India and say, look, we've got this packet of capacitors, I can give it to you for 100 rupees or $100, whatever currency you're familiar with. So someone like me who's sitting in India, very close to that customer, has no choice but to also offer it at 100. This is a globalized industry, as Professor Chandwani mentioned, which means that we went to zero duty on all electronic items. ITA 1 is the agreement, Information Technology Agreement 1. which was applicable in 2005. So anybody dealing with IT and IT products across the world, all the WTO signatories, 172 countries, have to follow that, and our tariff lines are at zero. So it's as globalized as it can get, and I've been that way for 6 years now. So I have no choice but also to offer the same at 100. However, there's a local tax in India called the central sales tax, which is at 2%. Funnily, that is to be only paid by somebody who, only by an Indian manufacturer. If he imports it, he doesn't pay that. So actually, I have to give it to him at, let's say, at about 98, while the Chinese is trying to give it at 100. That's a minor tax issue. In this example, you will notice that the major cost, like raw material, at 48, I've kept the same with China. The example is to make that even if I become as competitive as a Chinese manufacturer, and I manage my raw material cost at the same level, I manage my manpower at the same, so productivity and cost of manpower, and I manage all the other expenses, 15.5% of them, at the same level as the Chinese. Even if I am at that stage, what happens to my company is what I want to illustrate to you. How competitive or non-competitive am I? While I bring all my raw materials from places like China or Germany or Korea or Taiwan, that's the 4 countries that I source my material from. None of this material is available in India because what we don't have is the whole ecosystem of making a component like capacitor. So we plugged out of that system 20 years ago. We got into a Japanese collaboration, learned how to do this, brought it to India, and life was good because we had huge tariff quotas. To import a capacitor, you needed 65% of duty. So however inefficient I was, my government protected me with the 65% wall. The raw material came in at maybe 40%, so I still had a 25% gap. To hide my inefficiencies or, let's say, the poor economies of scale or whatever name you give it. Life was going on till 2005. In 2005, when these walls have come down, not in one instance, but gradually, we are now faced with a situation that you have no such protection. You have to fend for yourself. So what I put here is, there is also the CST or the central sales tax applicable in all the raw materials that I buy locally. Assuming this example that I have 50%, okay, so that's a minor detail, 0.48, 0.5% of a difference comes in because of that. Those two are problems because of tax. Yeah, none of us can do very much for it. Now let's look at 3 problems that come because of the infrastructure or the lack of infrastructure in this country, vis-a-vis China. Yeah, and it's not just a pure Indian example. As I take this around the world and several hats that I wear, I find that a lot of them resonate with it, in some way or the other. The raw material support, or let's call it the whole inward and outward logistics, not just the cost of transporting goods, but the cost of planning them. So if in India you were to plan a 1 week lead time, a 1 week inventory, it's an impossible task because you can spend as much as 1 week at the airport trying to clear your goods. So you have to have 1 plus 1 week at least, even if you're bringing goods by air, etc., etc. The cost of transportation, because the infrastructure is poor, is quite high. There are a whole lot of transactional costs still involved. Most developing countries have it. I said there are changes in the last 1 year. And fortunately, all this is getting better, but it's still pretty bad. Yeah. So the costs are coming down, efficiencies are getting better in India. But if you compare with China, we are nowhere on that as yet. And that cost is about 2.5 rupees or percentage of my total sales price, vis-a-vis 1 in China. Let's look at the other one. Power. Energy in this country is far more expensive than it is in China. It's not available most of the time, and if you make something like a capacitor, you need a 24-hour electricity. You need a very good quality of electricity, so you need to put it through a UPS. You need to have a whole team that monitors that. And this whole adds up to something like 5% of my selling price vis-a-vis 2% in China. And the last one there is the cost of finance. This is not it's a capital-intensive business. If you add 50% value in manufacturing, obviously you must be paying through high capital costs or high working capital, one of those two. So for a business of $100, I need an investment of 80. And I've kept the same for China and India to be able to do that kind of business. Let's say 1:1 or 1:1.2 is the investment to turnover ratio. And hence, my finance cost, obviously, we borrow at something like 14% if you're in a small and medium enterprise in India. The Chinese get it at less than 6%. And a lot of investors in China are either Chinese or Japanese or Korean or American, and they are able to borrow at 3 or 4 or 5% at times. So that's the difference that let's say half is what China gets, even in a small and medium enterprise. Now this means that only these 4 or 5 reds mean that while the Chinese guy, even at $100, will make a $19 or 19% profit, the Indians will make half, 9.5. If I divide that by the investment, the ratio, I make a 12% return on investment, whereas the Chinese makes a 24% return. The Chinese government incentivizes exports in a big way, and they still continue to do that as of today. So what they do is they give you a complete VAT refund on your entire export. The total VAT on Chinese products is 17%. And when you export something like a capacitor, you get a total refund, which means they get 17% of the amount of the export bill or the FOB back from the government. You have already spent 50% of that on buying your raw materials, let's say it's about 50. So 50% of 17, that's 8.5, is a sort of an export incentive that you're able to get every time you export out of China. And that's the reason why they have this huge export surplus. And that means that while this return on investment really is more like 34, 35%, we are stuck at 12%. That is, if you have managed your raw materials, your manpower, and all your other expenses exactly like the Chinese, which is an impossible task. This explains something like a 20% difference between Chinese manufactured goods of a good quality vis-a-vis goods manufactured anywhere else of a good quality. So we're not talking about bad quality, we're saying apples to apples. 20% is exactly what they do. And if you were to look at, of course, the whole yuan and the fact that we don't agree with the value of the yuan as an enemy, that's an additional one to this equation. So what does this tell me? If I look at it as a manufacturer, my CFO advises me that I have two fantastic looking factories in Noida, not very far from here. The cost of real estate is very high. And the first thing I want to do is put these two factories on rent. Because I will make more money than I make out of the net profit of running this whole business of 500 people. That's the advice that I get from my finance advisor. That seems to be the reality of the business. Yet there is something that we have done, which is what I think I want to share with you in the next half an hour or so, of how we make it work, how we are able to beat the Chinese at this, and how we were able to acquire a company in China and do this exactly, try and do the same thing in China. Any questions so far on this one? Okay, let's move on there.